Okay, well, it gives me the greatest pleasure to welcome you here today to the 13th annual Benjamin and Anne A. Pinkel Lectures on Mind-Brain Paradigms. These lectures are made possible by a generous gift from Sheila Pinkel on behalf of the estate of her parents. The lectures are a most fitting tribute to the memory of Benjamin Pinkel, creating as they do a forum for the continuing discussion and investigation of fundamental questions concerning the nature of the mind, which were his intellectual passion. Dr. Pinkel, who received his BSc in electrical engineering from the university in 1930, sought in his 1992 monograph, Consciousness, Matter, and Energy, to, and here I quote Dr. Pinkel, propose an expansion of the scientific view of nature to include a concept of mind. In light of this proposal, it seems especially appropriate that these lectures should be sponsored by our university's Institute for Research in Cognitive Science. This institute has as its mission the development of a scientific understanding of cognitive processes and the creation of technologies based on this understanding, a mission very much in harmony with Dr. Pinkel's vision. And now, well, actually, before I give you my colleague, Michael Weisberg, who will introduce today's distinguished speaker, Patricia Smith Churchland, who will speak to us about how the mind makes morals, I would like to present Patricia a copy of Dr. Pinkel's book on behalf of the Institute.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you,
Nice.
Patricia.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Michael Weisberg. Thanks.
Thanks, Scott. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce today Professor Patricia Smith Churchland. She's Professor Emerita of Philosophy at the University of California, San Diego, and also the Salk Institute for Biological Studies. Professor Churchland studied at the University of British Columbia and the University of Pittsburgh before going up to Oxford, where she received her BPhil. She was on the faculty of the University of Manitoba and spent an academic year at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton before arriving at San Diego, which has been her academic home ever since. Professor Churchland has received many awards and honors, but just to name a few, she received the MacArthur Foundation Research Fellowship in 1991. She became the University of California's Presidential Chair in Philosophy in 1999, and of course is today the 13th annual Pinkel Lecturer for the Institute of Research in Cognitive Science, surely the pinnacle of a career of a cognitive scientist. Besides writing many highly regarded research articles, Professor Churchland has published a number of very influential books, including and especially her 1986 book, Neurophilosophy Towards a Unified Science of the Mind-Brain, and her most recent book, which this is the cover, What Brain Trust, What Neuroscience Tells Us About Morality. And I have it on good authority. It was just this week received by the Penn Bookstore. There are many copies, and I encourage all of you to go have a look at it and buy a copy after the lecture. But let me just turn a little bit to tell you about Professor Churchland. So to tell you a little bit more about the background of her work, I thought I would tell you a story about how I first met Professor Churchland. When I was a freshman, or sophomore maybe, at UCSD, I took the required Introduction to Logic course, which, at least in those days, was regularly taught by Professor Churchland. And it was taught at UCSD, unlike at Penn, it taught to lecture halls of hundreds of students, 300 students or so at a time. And one of the units of this course had to do with what logicians call informal fallacies. Fallacies like begging the question or employing a slippery slope in their argument. And this was clearly one of Pat's very favorite parts of the course to teach. And she took great delight in illustrating each fallacy by using quotations from her critics and some of the people that she wanted to attack. And so, for example, I remember her showing a quotation from John Searle to the effect that it was simply inconceivable and unimaginable that anyone could ever show how the connection between some aspect of conscious experience and some region of the brain. And the next slide, of course, had a study or two that actually established this connection, and so showed, of course, that this was clearly an appeal to ignorance, or perhaps maybe an appeal to false authority on Searle's part. I think this really exemplifies Pat's really great contribution to philosophy. Whenever there are empirical data available, her work on a wide range of topics in philosophy of mind or science has been informed by it. And when the requisite data wasn't available, she has been known to get her hands quite literally dirty with brains and get the data herself. So her work exemplifies the idea that there's no such thing as first philosophy, that philosophical reflection about the nature and function of minds or of morality must be informed and may even be transformed by the findings of the natural sciences. Many philosophers, and even those not in her own subfields, have taken these themes and her exemplifications of them to heart in their own work, and I certainly count myself among them. So now, for much of her career, Pat has worked on foundational questions about the nature of mind and is well known for defending a version of eliminative materialism, which is the thesis that folk psychological notions such as beliefs and desires may be eliminated as psychology and neuroscience mature. But she's also always been interested in questions about the nature and origins of morality, and this work has been synthesized in her new book, Brain Trust. She argues in this book that the evolved structure, processes, and chemistry of the brain incline us to strive for the well-being of our allies as well as ourselves. And she will discuss these themes in her lecture today, which is titled, How the Mind Makes Morals. So please join me in welcoming Professor Churchland, our 13th Pinkel lecturer.
Well, thank you so much. And I should say Michael did quite well in that class, actually. Well, it's a great honor and a great pleasure to be here today and to give the 13th Pinkel lecture. It's always a particular and special pleasure to come to Penn. It's been a while since I've been here, and it really is a thrill to see how beautiful the campus has become. So I'm going to move right on and try to say a little bit about the neurobiological story about the platform for morality. And I should just begin by saying that it does seem that the story of moral behavior has two major components. And one, of course, is the biological platform, and the other one has to do with culture and the evolution, the cultural evolution of certain kinds of social practices and conventions, and the way that brains are, in particular human brains, are able to pick up and conform to and sometimes change those social practices and conventions. What I will mostly address has to do with the neurobiological platform, insofar as it makes possible certain aspects of the cultural phenomenon that we know as sociality and social behavior. But I won't have a very great deal to say about the cultural part of the story. So in addressing the neurobiology of sociality and hence of moral behavior, I want to begin with an idea that was expressed by Paul MacLean, who was a neurologist at NIH. And he pointed out quite rightly that what is new with mammals is nursing and parental care, playful behavior, separation vocalization. When the baby rat falls out of the nest, it squeaks and squeals. It bothers the mother to hear the squeaking and squealing. It's painful in a certain sense, and she hoists it back into the nest. And the other thing that is rather new is mate attachment. And so this prompted Paul MacLean to say that the history of the evolution of mammals is the history of the development of a family way of life. And this suggested to me that although from the point of view of evolutionary biology, it's very common to lump all altruistic or cooperative behavior together, that is insects, fish, birds, and mammals, that it might be that these actually have rather different genetic and rather different neurobiological bases. And that the neurobiological basis for sociality that we see in mammals is almost certainly quite distinct from what we see in ants and termites. Now, birds are a rather different sort of case, and it may be that what we're looking at is a rather similar story. But we don't actually know, and that's partly because we know much less about the neurobiological basis of sociality in birds than we do in humans. But what we do know suggests that either there was convergent evolution or perhaps there was a common ancestor who had the same kind of sociality that we see in both. At any rate, it's that possibility is suggested by the fact that the peptide I'm going to talk a lot about, namely oxytocin, seems to be important for sociality both in the case of mammals and in the case of birds. Now, as we know, of course, the evolution of the mammalian brain was really an extraordinary thing. And amongst various things that appeared, in addition to the 6-layer cortex that seems to have made learning and flexibility in behavior so important in mammalian species, there were many other changes as well. But the flexibility in learning, of course, comes at a certain cost. And as we see in this slide, a turtle hatches out of its egg. It's basically ready to go, and there is no mum around to tend it and feed it and ensure that it gets to the water in the proper way that it needs to. On the other hand, of course, all mammals are dependent on their mother, and in some cases on both the mother and the father. And the dependency, especially in humans and in other large-brained mammals, can actually last for a very long time. So the dependency requires a real change in the mammalian brain of the mother and, in some instances, of the father. It requires that that mother takes care of, feeds, nurtures, and responds to the needs of the infant. Now, there are a number of neurochemicals that are absolutely vital in this story, but I just want to begin by mentioning oxytocin. And I should probably have up here also its sibling peptide, vasopressin, which probably had a common ancestor. And these they differ really only in a couple of amino acids. In this slide, of course, we're seeing common mammalian behavior, suckling. And one of the things that's very important about suckling is that oxytocin is released in the brain, both of the infant and of the mother. And it's important for the attachment and the bonding that takes place between the mother and the infant. And that attachment means that, for example, when the baby disappears or the baby is taken away, the mother is upset and feels pain and does what she can to try to retrieve the baby. So what is it? Let me just mention something that I find really interesting from an evolutionary point of view, and that is that all vertebrates have oxytocin and vasopressin or some homologue thereof. So what's new with mammals is really that Mother Nature, so to speak, recruited those peptides for rather new jobs. And so it's not that suddenly something wholly new arose, but as we so often see in the course of biological evolution, old things are recruited, modified, changed, and put to new uses. The hypothesis then that I want to develop is that sociality is a basic value for social mammals, and that sociality comes about as a result of natural selection. And I think the many, many reports that we have of field ethologists telling us about the value to animals of living in groups, where those values are going to depend a lot on how those animals make their living and on the ecological conditions, that we understand that being together in a group can be very important for defense, for mutual care, for food sharing, and for a variety of other tasks. The hub of the story, but only the hub of the story, is oxytocin. And I'll say a little bit more about what we think at this point is the role of oxytocin in undergirding sociality in humans. That the basic urges to be together, to have the infant close by, and so forth, those basic urges constitute a kind of platform. But nevertheless, if the animal lives in a social environment, even a small social environment that just encompasses the mother and the father and the siblings, nevertheless, the infant needs to learn the ways of the others, the temperaments of the others, how to predict what the other will respond, how the other will respond in certain kinds of conditions in order best to survive and to prosper. And with the elaboration of prefrontal structures, especially in large-brained mammals, we see the emergence of a kind of flexibility and a capacity for self-control, and also, of course, for seeing further into the future and for reorganizing one's goals and plans and so forth accordingly. So this is not a story that is unique to humans. It's a story that explains how so much of what our sociality is like has deep roots in the evolution of mammalian brains. So let's then talk about how this actually might have happened, albeit in a rather schematic way. All animals are organized to see to their own survival and their well-being. The variables within the homeostatic safety range have to be attended to so that the animal does not get too hot or too cold, so that it is not too hungry, so that it does not lack oxygen. It's also the case that there are homeostatic emotions that respond to things like threat. And probably fear and pain are instances of those homeostatic emotions. In vertebrates, and in particular in mammals, the circuitry is really part of the brain stem. And the circuitry, although you might think, well, it's just the brain stem, is actually extraordinarily complicated. And one of the things that's so interesting, I think, about the circuitry of the brain stem is not only does it ensure that we are within the proper homeostatic range, but it also sets priorities. So that you don't, even if you're very hungry, you don't keep feeding if there is a predator from which you need to flee. So it's not just then that these homeostatic variables have to be seen to, it's also, as Paul MacLean said, that it's organized to see to the 4 Fs, the feeding, fleeing, fighting, and reproduction. And it sometimes, because I think there is no, and this is a point that many people in cognitive science have made, because there is no clean distinction between rationality and the emotions, but rather it looks like part of a continuum, it does suggest, when you think about the intelligence of the brainstem, that we can already see certain rudiments of rationality in the way brain stems respond to contingencies and the way that they prioritize. I mean, it's really interesting to me, for example, that even lobsters fighting over some food or other, they'll fight a little bit, and then when one recognizes that, you know, he just doesn't have a chance, he backs off. That's not stupid, and it's not exactly a reflex. It involves being able to size up what's going on and to make an adaptive response. So the hypothesis, and this is really something I got from Jaak Panksepp many years ago, the hypothesis really is that the deepest level of value, and I think of values as more fundamental than rules in sociality and morality, the deepest level of value is what emerges from the brainstem. And what it seems that happened in part, and this is to put it in very simplified terms, what happened in the evolution of the mammalian brain, given the need to see to these helpless but potentially smart infants, is that the circuitry to take care of my own homeostatic variables expanded. So that just as I take care of my own temperature, oxygen, and food, so I take care of its temperature, oxygen, food, and so forth. Now, it's not that a mother rat cannot distinguish between herself and the pups, but rather it's just that she recognizes that when it squeals, she feels pain and she needs to do something, and she makes the appropriate behavior. So the idea really is that the homeostatic circuitry for self-care and self-survival and self-prospering is extended and expanded, and in ways, in the details of which we do not yet understand, to the care of others. So the important simplification here really is that the social urges involve pleasure and pain caused by social interactions. All social mammals of any consequence feel pain when they are punished, but particularly they feel pain if they are ostracized and shunned. It feels bad. And we take pleasure, as baby rats do, in being groomed. I was going to say in being licked, but you know what I mean, in being groomed and cuddled and so forth. And this connects to the pleasure circuitry. And so pleasure and pain, although of course we want to elaborate that story in subtle and complex ways, pleasure and pain are really the anchors for what goes on in social behavior. This is a slide I got from Matt Lieberman, who sketches out very schematically the pain and pleasure systems in the human brain, which are very, very, very similar so far as we know, given the anatomy at this point, to the circuitry seen in all mammals. But what's kind of interesting is that it suggests that an old hypothesis, namely that the social emotions kind of are a wholly new invention, is not exactly right. It looks like what we call the social emotions is really an extension and an elaboration of the basic caring about me emotions that are already in place in all vertebrates. Now, I've been trying to be cautious about this story and indicating that it is a simplification. And this is just a reminder in this slide taken from Don Pfaff that it isn't only a story about oxytocin, and that there are many other parts to the story that are extremely important, and all of them have to kind of work together in a very particular sort of way in order to achieve proper social behavior. What's not actually on this slide, and what we also think plays a really important role in sociality and in the pleasure we derive from company, has to do with the endogenous opiates. And there is some evidence, both from animal studies and from humans, that if, for example, you give a suckling rhesus monkey naloxone, which binds to the endogenous opiate receptors, so that her own endogenous opiates will not produce an effect of pleasure. If you do that, she tends to begin to neglect the baby, and the baby has to really get to her in order for her to suckle, as opposed to the normal behavior where she'll take the baby and comfort it and cuddle it and so forth. So there's a story there. I think it's not yet understood in anything like the detail that ultimately we would like to understand. So then, just to kind of reiterate, it looks like attachment and trust are the platform for moral values. I should maybe just say here that it's a fair question what I mean by moral. And I don't really have what you might call a precise definition. And that's because I think there isn't really one that's available. I tend to think of, in the human domain, what we call moral is on the very serious end of what we'd call social. So serious questions having to do with the welfare and pain and so forth of others is one thing. Whether to lick your knife in public is a social convention, but not of any consequence. So even if you're offended if I lick my knife at table, that's probably quite different from me grossly insulting you in public, or my, convincing you to put all of your money into my wonderful Ponzi scheme. So I think of attachment and trust then. I haven't said too much yet about trust. I think of attachment and trust as a platform for moral values. They're the dispositions that contour the problem space. so that within the problem space, such things as how best to reconcile, when to back down in a fight, how to distribute resources when they are scarce, and so forth. There are many kinds of solutions to that problem that social animals will not entertain and need not entertain. And finally, they are the motivation to find good solutions to practical social problems. Now, as I said, I think culture is an essential part of the whole story. And just for the record, I listed a number of authors who are working on this and who have much more sophisticated things to say about this than I do. So far, it's essentially been a story about how the homeostatic circuitry has extended to offspring. But morality involves more than that. So how do we get from family values, so to speak, to the larger sphere? And here I want to talk about prairie voles and montane voles. And many of you will know the story about prairie and montane voles, but it's just about my favorite story, so I'm going to go through it, but I'll do it fairly quickly. So there are many, many species of voles. And Sue Carter happened, who's shown here, she's at the University of Illinois in Chicago. She happened to notice that prairie voles, after the first mating, tend to bond for life. They are attached for life. And that the male will guard the nest. He just likes to hang around with her, and she just really likes to hang around with him. And there are very nice experiments showing that this is the case. The male also, and that's probably him here, the male also will take care of the pups. He will defend the pups. He huddles over them. And finally, the siblings will also take care of the pups, which is rather unusual. Montane voles, by contrast, have a very different social behavior. They are promiscuous bonders. The male takes no part whatever in the rearing of the pups. And even the female cares for the pups, but she abandons them much earlier than the female prairie voles do. Now, because voles are really rather similar species, Sue Carter said, what's the difference in the brain? Is it possible to find out what the difference in the brain is between prairie voles and montane voles? And an answer actually emerged. Although there are probably other components to the story, this does seem to be an important part of the story. So these are coronal sections taken from montane voles and from prairie voles. OTR means oxytocin receptor. So, of course, for oxytocin to have any effect on the brain, it has to do so by binding to a receptor which is on a neuron, and it changes some aspect of that neuron's function. So the density of receptors is going to be important. So if you had no receptors for oxytocin, even if you had lots of oxytocin sloshing around in the brain, it wouldn't help, or it wouldn't do anything for you, let's put it that way. And this is vasotocin receptors. So the main finding, and they looked at many, many brains in order to be sure that this was correct, was that the density of receptors in the nucleus accumbens, part of the reward system, the density of receptors for oxytocin was much higher in the prairie vole than in the montane vole. The density of receptors in the ventral pallidum, also part of the striatal reward system, was much higher in the prairie vole than in the montane vole. Now, they weren't sure that this correlation meant anything, and so they did the kinds of manipulations that would occur to you in order to determine it. And suffice it to say, without going through all those experiments, but some of them included blocking those receptors, suffice it to say that it looks at the moment that this is the main thing that distinguishes that social aspect of behavior in prairie voles and montane voles. Now, initially, people thought, well, heck, if you can find that difference, and it really is as simple as density of receptors, you should be able to find the gene, because you should be able to find the gene that regulates the gene for making receptors. After all, it's just a protein, a receptor. You should be able to find the gene. And initially, it looked like a region had been found. Larry Young and his colleagues did find a region in prairie voles that was different from that in montane voles, and they did the manipulations suggesting that that was the critical feature. So that all looked good until people did the genes in pine voles versus meadow voles. So pine voles are also monogamous bonders versus meadow voles who are not, and a quite different set of genes seem to be involved. So, I mean, as we often discover in molecular biology, the gene story turns out to be much more complex than we think. Nevertheless, what does seem clear is that, at least in these animals and in some other animals that were looked at, for example, California deer mice and in marmosets, who are also monogamous pair bonders, that the density of receptors for these two very simple but important peptides is a very important factor. Now, it's not known in humans what the story is. That is to say, let's go back a little bit. Although many species, I guess the vast majority of species of birds, are monogamous pair bonders. Only about 5% of mammals appear to be monogamous pair bonders. Just a little aside here also, and that is that monogamous pair bonding does not imply sexual exclusivity, not even in prairie voles. Which means that if you do the genetic studies on the pups, what you find is that both partners are getting a little crumpet on the side, as they say in England. So it looks like much of the attachment and much of the sexual activity is with the mate, but that's not necessarily, that doesn't preclude other activities from taking place. Now, we can't tell about receptor densities for these two receptors in humans because the way that you determine receptor densities involves putting in a dye that binds to the receptor, then, as we say, sacrificing the animal and cutting the brain and then counting those sites that show the dye. And obviously that's not something we can do in humans. There may be ways of determining such things as techniques get fancier and more interesting. But at the moment, we don't actually know the answer. The other thing, of course, is that one should always remind ourselves that there's always individual variability in a species. So not all prairie voles show the phenotype. Some of them are kind of loners, whereas others of them are very attached. And that brings me just to this other aspect of sociality that I find so interesting about prairie voles. So if you take a basket of prairie voles and you kind of park them at different places in the room, they'll eventually kind of all, come together, and they kind of just like to be together. And if you do that with montane voles, they're really quite happy staying where they are. So there's also something about just liking to be with others that turns out to be important. Now, initially, I said that attachment and trust seem to be part of the basic platform. So what's the trust bit? And that, I think, has come out of really close studies by many people on what actually oxytocin does well, let's start with the prairie voles, where it's been studied so carefully. And the answer, first of all, is that it decreases defensive postures. So when an unknown animal, a strange animal, comes into the group, initially you don't know whether this guy's going to be friendly, whether he's going to be nasty, whether he's going to be okay. There are defensive postures. With raising the level of oxytocin, those defensive postures decrease. So when that animal makes a kind of friendly gesture, then there can be an increase in oxytocin, which is also part of the loop whereby when oxytocin goes up, your stress hormones go down. And when stress hormones go down, that feels good because you're not anxious, you're not being excessively alert to problems and so forth. It looks as though part of what goes on with the release of oxytocin from the hypothalamus is that there is downregulation of certain parts of the amygdala and also downregulation of arousal in the brainstem. How exactly the trade-off is handled with stress hormones like corticotropin-releasing factor is not completely understood, and suffice it to say it's more complicated than what I've shown here, but that gives you the basic story. So when animals are able to be in a comfortable situation with each other, their oxytocin levels are up, their stress hormones are down, they're able to trust one another. I don't have to be vigilant that you're going to balk me. And under those kinds of conditions, especially if over the long haul I know that you are trustworthy, then we kind of have the conditions without having a separate gene for it. We have the conditions for cooperation and working together. And that's often comes to my mind, at least, in thinking about wolves. Now, as I'm sure you all know, that wolves show behavior that's not unlike what my golden retrievers show when they get back together. They jump on each other, they lick on each other, they wag their tails, and wolves do much the same thing. And here you can see them being happy together and howling probably for the others to join the hunt. Now, wolves are really, really terrific pack hunters, although when I say they're really, really good, it's estimated that they're successful only about 1 time out of 10. But I have a feeling that's better than I would do after much of the same prey. I mean, it's interesting, really, how some of the things that animals do are dismissed as just kind of reflexive behavior. So I lived on a farm, and on the farm was encircled by a creek, and in the creek lived beavers. And the beavers, of course, built dams. But because we didn't want the water backed up for complicated reasons, my father would rip the dam apart at night, and of course, or in the afternoon, and the next morning it would be rebuilt. Beautifully built, because this was rushing water. So one day my sisters and I, without much to do, thought, let's try to build a dam like the beavers do, just with our hands. Like, we don't get to use any tools. It's really hard. I mean, and these are just beavers, right? Although I must say, beavers are monogamous pair bonders. Anyway, so to get back to trust and cooperation, I can cooperate with you in a risky undertaking if I trust you, but not if I don't. And so if we've been together, and now I'm talking wolf talk, if we've been together and I know I can count on you and we lick each other, we like each other, then I can do what these guys are doing. So what you'll notice, and this is a rather unusual situation, but wolves, of course, are tenacious. Here's a grizzly. This is in the north. Here's a grizzly, and the grizzly has a moose down, and he's obviously very keen to keep that moose. And here are the wolves. And all of the videos that you see show this extraordinary, complicated, sophisticated behavior where they're watching each other, watching the prey, watching what the alpha male is doing, and they are relentless. And in this instance, they were successful. And the grizzly is not, I mean, that's not chopped liver. So, highly social mammals. The thought is that relative to the ecological conditions and the way an animal makes its living, that it might sometimes be worth it to extend care or to extend attachment and bonding, not just to infants and offspring, not just to mates, but also to affiliates, as in the wolf case. And that when it does, and it can be useful, but it need not always, then we see this extension to kith. Now, I've given them slightly different colors to indicate that probably most of the time, but of course not always, there may be more intensive investment in kin than in kith. And this, of course, has been noticed in humans as well as in other animals. In this slide, I really just want to emphasize that different social organizations are possible and that the kinds of social organizations that a particular species has is, of course, always going to reflect non-trivial aspects of its environment. And so here is one of these lovable meerkats out in the Kalahari Desert. And the males take turns standing sentry looking for lions. Not a lot of fun, probably, but there he is. In meerkats, as in wolves, there's only one breeding pair. But, of course, that's not the way it is with all social mammals, or even all social big-brain mammals. And if the alpha female finds that one of the ladies has got herself pregnant, she is quite apt to kill her. On the other hand, it's very interesting that the antes, so if the alpha female has a litter and there are babies, the antes will help. And they will care for the babies and do things with them, and they will even lactate. And so that suggests an interesting role in this particular species that oxytocin plays simply as a result of being attached to these infants, albeit not the infants of her own. Now, this has been a nice story so far about cooperation and trust and kindness and so forth. But, of course, especially in humans and in chimpanzees, I'm not sure about other species, but I think we do not see it in bonobos, and we do not see it in marmosets, and probably Robert Seyfarth can tell us much more about where else we do and don't see it. But offsetting in-group bonding is out-group hostility. And in humans, it seems something that's very easy to manipulate, as has been shown in a whole range of psychological experiments. And on the other hand, close in-group bonding also seems to be an extremely important part of human sociality. In-group bonding is probably important for sociality in all highly social groups. And it certainly is in humans, and arguably many institutions have developed in order to foster in-group bonding. Institutions including things like religions or special kinds of rituals, dancing around the fire in preparation for an attack or undertaking a particularly risky job. Aggression, I think, is very, very complicated. Because there are many kinds of aggression, there's what's involved in within the group competition, but very often it's carefully regulated so that the animals are not actually hurt, but enough happens so that one can recognize that the other guy is eventually the stronger and the more dominant. But then, of course, there can be aggression in the predator situation. There can be aggression when the predator attacks the babies or attacks some member of the group, as, for example, a lion attacking a baboon. And sometimes, depending on the nature of the situation, the other baboons will try to do something about it, but sometimes not. I think aggression is probably going to be much more complicated, actually, than this kind of sociality of extending trust that we see as originating out of the parental-infant bond. Now, I want to say a little bit that's relevant to culture, and that is that if you look at culture sort of from the biological perspective, you can think of humans as creating long-lasting niche changes that actually alter their selective pressures. And this can happen when there are certain kinds of solutions to difficult problems, solutions that involve, for example, building a boat. And building a boat, this one happens to be a Haida boat that is very suitable to being on the very wavy ocean by the Queen Charlotte Islands in northern British Columbia, as contrasted to the kind of boat that the Inuit built. And this might be a point to say a little bit about genes. It is sometimes argued, and this I think is actually quite a worrisome argument. It's sometimes argued that when we see that a behavior is universal or very nearly so, that you can infer that it's got a genetic basis. And I don't actually think that's true. And in the case of boats, I think what we see is that essentially every human group that we know anything about, and even Homo erectus probably, if they had access to wood and water was nearby, they made boats out of wood. Now you could say, right, it's universal, so there's got to be a gene for making boats out of wood. Well, I don't really think so. I think it's very unlikely. Similarly, essentially every human group we know anything about has figured out ways of carrying stuff on their back. But I don't think there's a gene for knapsacks or what have you. And so I mean, this is partly because I'm going to segue into the fact that humans have this enormous capacity for learning and for learning in a very deep way so that certain things become intuitive and obvious, and yet they are rooted in learning. The other point that those people who do think about culture make is that as a population grows, for example, especially after the advent of agriculture, then there can be benefits that come from trusting relationships that go beyond the groups. And Matt Ridley, I think, has done, as has Paul Seabright, a wonderful job of talking about how early trade amongst hunter-gatherer groups was probably very important for establishing trusting relationships with strangers. And some recent work by Joe Heinrich has also shown that there is a difference if you measure that difference by using one of these trust games that neuroeconomics has developed. There's a difference in the degree of trust manifested by a hunter-gatherer group that does lots of trading and a hunter-gatherer group that is largely self-sufficient. These guys are less trusting in those games than those guys. Now, of course, I said I think probably religion plays some role, and especially as groups get larger, and you need ways of enforcing some of the social conventions and the social rules. And I think it is useful to create a myth, or maybe it's not a myth, but to have a story that indicates that you might be punished. Okay. Now, I did say that I didn't have a crisp definition of morality, and I think it's reasonable not to. But I think this is not just a trivial point. I think it's actually a fairly deep point. In the 60s, Eleanor Rosch did some work, followed up by George Lakoff and many other psychologists, which showed that our everyday categories, chair, coat, house, river, vegetable, are similar in the following respect. They have a radial structure with sort of prototypes at the center, where the prototypes are things on which we pretty much all agree. And then there are degrees of similarity falling off as you go out further, and that there are fuzzy boundaries. There aren't necessary and sufficient conditions for being a mountain or for being a river as opposed to a stream, as opposed to a creek, as opposed to a brook. And so the classic example, of course, is vegetable, where, at least in America, carrots are the prototypical vegetable. Not everybody agrees that a radish is a vegetable. Some people will say, it's just a garnish. It's not, really something you're expected to eat, but people do. And then there's mushrooms, which are kind of way out on the fuzzy end of things. And to be honest, there's no point in arguing about whether mushrooms are really vegetables or not, because there is no fact of the matter. It really, and mostly it doesn't matter. If you can get them in the store where there are other vegetables, why do you care really that it's not a real vegetable? Right? Now, what Lakoff and Mark Johnson did that I think was really interesting was to say that the same is true in the social domain. That we learn the prototypical cases of what it is to be a friend or to be honest or when to tell the truth. We sometimes are given rules, like never lie, but before very long you teach your kid, well, yeah, but it's okay in this instance, or it's okay in that instance. And what they learn are the prototypical exceptions and the prototypical cases where you must not lie. And the same, I think, is actually true of what we count as moral or as not moral. That our culture provides us with a story or a set of stories about what are the prototypical instances of morals, of morally appropriate behavior. There's similarity of cases, but it falls off as we get towards the periphery. And there are some cases on the periphery where there might actually not be a right answer. For example, there might be no right answer, whether it was okay for Martin Hartwell, a bush pilot who went down in the Arctic while carrying a nurse and an Inuit boy with appendicitis. Bush plane crashed. They waited for days and days, and nothing happened. Actually, the little boy survived. He finally starved to death. And Martin Bushwell ate the nurse. He ate her leg. Well, some people are quite horrified by this. There may not be a right answer. And similarly, many people are horrified by the idea of eating a dog. The Inuit are horrified by the idea that you would starve to death when the dog is right there. And so I think that the prototypes also vary as the culture varies, and that often the culture reflects something about the ecology. And I try to make that point in this slide, which is sort of goofy, but there is no necessary and sufficient conditions for defining what a house is. There is no precise definition. If you're in Texas, that's a house. If you're in the Arctic, a completely different thing is a house. If you're on the prairie, circa 1910, that's your house. Where I grew up, well, there should be a window there, I guess, but that was a house. Paul's mom was born in one of these, so that was a house, and so forth. So there can be, as Wittgenstein might have said, a certain family similarity between these prototypes, but there isn't something like a set of precise definitions for what counts as a house. And just as some of our social conventions and our social practices reflect our way of making a living and the equipment we've got and the technology we've got, so I think it is in the case of a house. Now, of course, one can't close without saying something about reasoning. And the Kantian tradition and philosophy, of course, advocates that we suppress emotion and we give all to reasoning. This seems to be biologically not a go. But one wonders what exactly reasoning is, because for many, many social problems, John Haidt notwithstanding, for many social problems, we might have an intuitive response, but then, of course, we think about it. When is a war a just war? I actually don't have an intuitive response for that. Maybe he does. And there are other questions about, for example, when and whether inheritance taxes are fair. That's something for which I don't have an intuitive response, and where it's important for us to reason together, to negotiate, for me to understand how you see it, and for you to understand how I see it, and so forth. I think of reasoning in an individual case, and this is a sloppy account because we don't know neurobiologically what reasoning is. In an individual case, I think of it as a constraint satisfaction process, where there are many constraints with different probabilities and different weights that somehow in the brain interact in such a way that the brain settles into a good local minimum, and the decision is made. How that works, of course, we'd like to know. But I think it's also a constraint satisfaction at the social level, where we get together to try to figure out what would be acceptable to us regarding inheritance laws. And reasoning has to be involved. There's no point in just saying, well, I have this intuition and I have this intuition, and we clash. I don't really have time to talk about that. That can come up in the question period. I include this because it's a way for me to emphasize that big brain mammals are capable of a lot of learning, and that we can sometimes end up doing things and behaving in a way in which you might think is surprising given what is supposed about our nature. Now, we have all learned, or at least I learned, that fundamentally orangs are loners. And that's partly got to do with the way that they make their living, and they each need a large territory. Of course, the mother and the infant are together until the infant is independent. But sometimes things can change. Now, this guy might be an outlier, or it might just be that the resources are available, and that allows his sort of suppressed sociality to spring forth. But here's the guy. He's in a rescue center, and the dog wanders into the rescue center, and before very long, like almost instantly, they become inseparable. And this seems so odd to me as a kind of social closeness and a real attachment and bonding between a dog and an orang. Now, of course, we see kinds of sociality that differ from the norm in lots of cases. Black bears can be very sociable depending on the availability of resources. And there can be cross-species fostering and cross-species care as well. I think one of the really important things that the people who look at the culture of all this do is ask the question, what kinds of institutions will be both stable and will help most people to maximize their well-being? And different ideas are beginning to emerge, but I think those are really, really important questions. And we do know that when certain kinds of institutions, such as institutions for policing and for the criminal justice system, when they come into being, it does change how people respond to things like aggression. And I think that's probably terribly important. And with that, I'll close. Thank you. Sure. Oh, yeah.
So before our reception, we have time for some questions. I believe there's a microphone on the floor. It's right here. So please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to come to you. And after the questions, there'll be a reception right outside the doors.
Hi. Your discussion at the end involving prototypes was interesting. I know that an experiment's been done. I think it was Lila Gleitman who did it. Is she in the room? Okay. Where asking people to rate how prototypical even numbers are. And 2 is very prototypical and other numbers aren't as prototypical, right? So even numbers, there is a fact of the matter, unlike vegetables.
Sure.
But they still look like prototypes with fuzzy edges. And I'm wondering, even though morals might seem like prototypes, there might be a fact of the matter that's we don't know or it's unknowable. I mean, most of us are scientists in the room, right? So, I mean, we know we don't know things, but we assume there's a fact of the matter, and we hope it's knowable. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that, whether it's necessarily the case that the same is true of morals.
I mean, that's a wonderful question, and I think that it's not necessarily true, but I think that morality is kind of human dependent in a way that, you know, being hemoglobin is not human dependent. And so there can always be a question, you know, is this really hemoglobin or not? But in the case of especially these things that we find out on the periphery, where there is a lot of disagreement, it's hard to see what would ground the fact of the matter, if you take my meaning. I mean, if you're Plato, you know what would do it, and that would be all the truths are written in Plato's heaven. But, you know, that's no good. And if you are a utilitarian like Peter Singer and you believe that you should maximize aggregate utility, then you think there's a fact of the matter because you just do your calculations, although it's sometimes quite difficult to get those calculations. I mean, how do you do the calculations for Martin Hartwell? And so it's hard to see where the fact of the matter would come from. Now, again, some people who have a particular kind of religious belief might say that you could go to that. But the problem is that there are many people who don't. I mean, you know, when you think about Asian religions where there isn't really a personal God of any kind at all, there's just, you know, really wise folks. And where there isn't a set of rules like the Ten Commandments. So it's hard to see how it couldn't be just something that humans come to agree about in the end. But so I think there's just more fluidity with regard to some of these things in the social and moral domain. Yeah, and that's not an answer that traditional philosophers would have liked. They want there to be either, you know, I'm right or you're right. But I don't think, you know, I think in the real world, alas, that ain't so.
Can you hear me? Right. Mm-hmm. I was hoping that you could situate your project against sort of what Jonathan Haidt is doing with moral modularity. So
yeah.
It came to my mind when you were talking about eating dogs.
Yeah.
And it looks like Haidt's going to say, well, it's going to pick up a disgust module that most people have, that I assume that most people in here are liberals. So we would say, well, that's probably disgusting, but that's not morally relevant. And Haidt says, well, for people who aren't Western liberals, disgust is one of the five sort of psychological bases for normativity.
Yeah, well, there are a number of things that I think, I mean, this is a really big sort of project that he's got going, and there are a number of things to be said. One is this, and I kind of alluded to...
Can you just say a little bit for other people?
Oh, okay. Jonathan, okay, let's see if I can do that. I have to, all right, okay.
The one-sentence summary.
The one-sentence summary. So the idea is that during human evolution, there were selective pressures that such that there came to be certain innate dispositions for loyalty, for disgust, for caring, for sanctity. I guess that's part of the disgust thing. And for what?
Avoidance of harm.
Avoidance of harm. Now, the thing of it is that ever since Plato, really, and probably before that, people have made lists of fundamental virtues. I mean, and it's a good thing to do. I think Plato's list was quite interesting. Aristotle had a quite different list. In Thomas Aquinas' list, it turns out that religious devotion or devotion to God turns out to be very important, but that's not the case in Aristotle's list. And in fact, Socrates absolutely rejects it. He says, we shouldn't have religion in there at all because that's something the Delphic oracle should be taken care of. So I mean, it's interesting to talk about, but when you talk about what's fundamental, and this I think is Jonathan Haidt's point, is he wants to link it to evolutionary biology. All right, go for it. What's the link? All right, so the link is universality of response. Well, it depends on how selective your evidence is. And anyway, universality doesn't imply innateness. All humans eat with their hands as long as they've got hands. Is that innate? I don't know. I mean, you could eat with your feet. You could just put your face into it. Do you need an innate hand module in order to eat with your hands? I don't think so. It's just, that's a really good and reasonable way to do the job. So the problem with innateness claims is this, that if you can't connect it to something in the neurobiology and you can't connect it to something known about the evolution of humans, and you can't connect it to genes, there are people who think it's only a just so story. And that's always been the difficulty with innateness claims. Now, occasionally you can make the connection. So for something like the eye blink reflex, we have a pretty good idea how to make that connection. or with something like having trichromacy. We think that that's innate. And we know something about how the genes for trichromacy evolved, and although we're not entirely sure of why that happened, and that it happened many times in evolutionary biology. So that's always the difficulty. And so I have no idea whether sanctity is innate or not. And I have no idea even whether sanctity is universal. That some people feel disgusted at the idea of eating a dog doesn't qualify. So, and much depends on the circumstances about what's found disgusting. So, I mean, those of you who go camping realize that you do things in the bush that you don't do normally. I was once told that by a very distinguished biologist that humans had this innate capacity or this innate disposition. I'm sorry, this is going to get a bit nasty, but anyway, this innate disposition to defecate in private. And I said, well, look, I mean, we were on the farm. We had a two-holer, you know, and most people did. What are you talking about? Well, it's that he had grown up under a very particular kind of circumstance where his intuitions were shaped and honed by the way he was brought up. I have no problems with a two-holer. I mean, you could say I'm a mutant, but then, you know, were we all mutants back on the farm? I don't think so. So strength of intuition, or the fact that it comes very automatically and so forth, doesn't tell you anything about where that comes from. And when you find that there is variability, and variability in context, but you have to actually look for it. So Mark Hauser says, everybody finds it disgusting to drink fresh apple juice out of a brand new bedpan. Well, it depends. Suppose you're out in the desert, right, and you're so thirsty, you're incredibly dehydrated. And along comes a camel, and strapped to the camel's back is a bedpan, which, lo and behold, has apple juice in it. Would you be so disgusted? I wouldn't be even a little bit disgusted if I was that dehydrated. I mean, I think it's just a lot harder than this. And if your science is such that you don't need to attach it to evolutionary biology in any way we know anything about, and you don't need to attach it to the brain, and you don't need to attach it to genes, heck, you can say anything. So it's a worry. I realize that he's become very popular, and there is a criticism of this in the book. There's also an article jointly published by me and Chris Suhler in the last issue of Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience. So I have actually thought about it. That didn't just come spontaneously.
I think for much of your talk you were alluding to Dunbar's number at various points. And I wonder if you can tell us about immune tests investigating the play of the immune system or other hormonal systems in Dunbar's number. And I ask in terms of morality because I think we're about to enter a period of planetary scarcity, a very moral question of who will live and who will die. And so I wonder if you could talk about any tests of sort of chemical, neurological roots for Dunbar's number.
So Robin Dunbar has made the claim that it's important for social animals to understand in quite a lot of detail the history and the temperament and the dispositions of the members of the group. And that seems very reasonable. And his idea with regard to humans is that we max out at about 150 people. That we can have a casual acquaintance with many more than that. But to really know people and work well with them and so forth, the number is about 150. I don't know of anything that connects to neurobiologically. And off the top of my head, I can't quite see how you do it. But, you know, really smart graduate students are always figuring out good solutions. So I don't know. There is a kind of relation that has recently been explored between levels of oxytocin and healing. And that's really because, I mean, it was prompted by the observation that there is this sort of biobehavioral loop where when oxytocin levels go up, corticotrophin-releasing factor and other stress hormones go down. And we've known, of course, for a long time that under conditions of stress, that things like healing take longer. I mean, in the rat studies, you know, if the rat has a cut on its leg and it's sitting there in a stressed situation all by itself, the healing takes N days. If there's another rat close by, it takes N minus M days, whatever that happens to be. So a study was recently done with humans, which has you know, certain queries and confounds, but to a first approximation, the affectionate high-level oxytocin couples healed faster in this administered lesion than the couples who were kind of at each other's throat and, you know, oh, Jim, did you have to say that kind of thing? And the healing was significantly lower. Now, that's only a behavioral study. So far as I know, it hasn't been replicated. We don't really know what the mechanism, other than this presumed idea that it's because the stress hormones are going down. But what the stress hormones exactly have to do with healing, you'd have to ask a physiologist who knows more than I do on that. Yeah. Yes?
Anyway, I was confused. Hi, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Hi, so as a philosopher, you're telling us there's a biological basis for morality. So you were hinting at it at the end, but what do you think the ramifications of that finding are for the history of madness and the treatment of psychotics and so on? And criminality.
Well, I mean, the treatment for schizophrenia and so forth is obviously a very, very complicated business. There is one place where people are interested in administering oxytocin with a view to changing a psychiatric condition. Well, actually, there's two. But one is post-traumatic stress disorder, where the thought is that because stress hormones are so high, if you give people oxytocin, maybe it'll make a difference. So far as I know, the results are not clear yet, whether that's effective. The other place is in autism. And there, I think, Angela Sirigu's group from France have some preliminary data saying that in high-functioning autistics, there is some change in behavior, so that there is eye contact that lasts a little bit longer, and there's a little bit more in the way of turn-taking. But these are really, really preliminary results at this point, and I think it's really too early. I mean, when I was in Japan and I gave this talk, someone said, well, surely you know that many Japanese parents are getting oxytocin online and spraying it up the nose of the kids to get them to be more social. And you know, I mean, this is really not a good idea. And why do I say that? Because oxytocin is a very powerful hormone. And you would no more sort of fool around with testosterone, say, in this way, as you should with oxytocin. So I think that great caution is actually in order. I mean, one of the things that Sue Carter's lab found was that if you just take a regular female prairie vole who's not yet mated, yet hasn't had pups, and you raise her level of oxytocin, she immediately goes into estrus. But the other thing they showed was that if you take a prairie vole female who's nicely attached to her mate and has had pups and everything is going along swimmingly, and you give her oxytocin, the attachment to the mate falls off. Now, this is kind of like, you know, that usual U-curve, upside-down U-curve that we see in biology. There is an appropriate level. And too much is not good. Too little is not good. And so I think we have to be extremely cautious. And the idea that, for example, you might treat really aggressive people by just shooting them up with oxytocin is just, I mean, I think it's nuts. So I'm glad you asked that, because it gave me an opportunity to make these cautions that it's we should just be really, really careful with it. We don't want 20 years down the pike people saying, you wrecked my life by testing me with oxytocin.
So I think this is going to bring the discussion to the end, but I just want to remind you again, there's a reception right out these doors, and you're all welcome to join us. And Professor Churchland will be there perhaps to ask a few more questions. Let's thank her again.
Thanks. Thank you.